Now, this is the only history book I've seen that does this, but the authors have done it, so I'll do it here. We've already visited China one time, and we'll be going back to China one more time. But right here in chapter 5, your authors choose to divulge, about 5 or 6 pages to China, even though, as far as we know, no Roman ever went to China, and we do not know of any China person who ever came to the Roman Empire. However, the development of the two places was parallel in a lot of ways. In other words, China had a unified area. If I can find a better map. China had a unified area on its side of the big continent of Eurasia, supercontinent of Eurasia, and Europe had a unified political system on its part of on the other side of Eurasia. The big supercontinent of Eurasia, if you put Europe and Asia into one big continent. Now we consider them two continents for political reasons. They have different cultures, and for many, many generations they never came in contact with each other. But on one side was one unity, on the other side was another. To compare them, the unity in China was to remain, China's borders was to remain all the way until this day. In the case of the unity of the Mediterranean world, the western part of the big continent of Eurasia, it didn't last. After 400, its political unity fragmented into many, many smaller countries, and every attempt that was made to unify it has failed. Didn't last. Anyway, the 400-year period we're talking about is the period of the Han Empire that went from 202 BCE to 221 CE. You're talking about a period of 423 years. Don't worry about the dates so much. We just have an idea that there was an empire there in China that lasted whose dynasty lasted about 400 years, the Han. And to this day, a lot of Chinese will look back to the time of the Han as being a time of greatness for their people, a time of unity. Now, the primary religion was Confucianism. Confucius had taken over, the idea had taken over. And during this time, for the first time in history, we come across the civil service examination. Now, we have a civil service exam in this country. Europeans did not start using a civil service exam until the 1700s, much later. What's so great about it? Well, simply this. The Chinese began to notice that a lot of times a father would be able to manage, particularly a father who had a position of authority. Maybe he's head of a province and he's able to manage this province really well. He would die and pass this on to a son who was mentally incompetent or just not suited for the job. In other words, the Chinese believed not very smart. Well, to keep competent people in charge of political offices, they set up a civil service exam where they believed if you could make a passing score on the exam, this showed that you were suited for a political office. Now, I had a student question one time, how does a test score show your suitability for office? And, oh, perhaps it doesn't. Nevertheless, it was a better means of determining who was fit for office than anything that they had had up to that time. Up to that time, it was a matter of either you were born into office or you somehow by finagling and manipulation acquired it. Sometimes by just outright coming in with an army and taking over. Well, they felt like the civil service exam was a better way. Now, the civil service exam was not a multiple choice test like we have today. It was simply where the instructor would ask you a bunch of questions and you would answer, sometimes orally or sometimes write the answers down on a sheet of paper. But they were more like an essay test. Eventually, after setting up this exam, they set up an academy where they could train students to take the test. Now, the civil service exam was a way that a brilliant Chinese person could move up into bureaucracy, move up to get a higher rank, but it was not necessarily, they did not make all Chinese men equal. And I have to say men because women did not take the test. But it did not make all Chinese men equal in that the poor people could not afford to get into the academy. So for the most part, the poor people were left out. Now occasionally, it's known there was sometimes there would come forth a brilliant, really brilliant poor person, and somebody high up would recognize him for his brilliance while he was quite young, and they would teach him to read and teach him to write and groom him for the exam. And sometimes a poor person could do fairly well on the exam. But for the most part, the exams were only, or the school for the exam was only open to the rich, so only the rich had any chance of excelling. And the rich then would only the rich had a chance to get a government position. However, it did keep incompetent firstborn sons from inheriting their father's government job. And if a firstborn son was known to be incompetent or could not do well on the exam, he'd be passed over for the promotion when it came up, and either a younger son or somebody who was a cousin or a distant relative, but still wealthy, could take over and get the exam. Now, the empire was large, and the Chinese empire, that is, and they needed able administrators, which they tried to get. However, a problem that the Chinese have had from the beginning up until modern times was court fights. Inside their own court, one faction would battle, I'm talking about the emperor's court, one faction would battle another. And if when the emperor died, the new emperor would have to learn, hey, I've got to make sure I have a firm hold on my own palace before I take off and go in China, because his problems could come from within his own palace. And most of the dynasties that were destroyed by factions within their own palace. So now a lot of them were destroyed from outside. Okay, a lot of them were, but a lot of them were factions within their own palace. Now we're going to be talking more about the civil service exam later on, the problems they had with it, but eventually the civil service exam was to spread to Japan, Korea, Vietnam, all throughout that part of the world. And it did not, like I say, did not do what it might have done, because humans are humans and humans have failings. It's known that there was cheating on the exam. And I'm going to save that to what I'm about to say till later, but it's probably for the exam. But believe me, I will talk about it later. Like I say, we're going to come into it, run into it in a little bit. Now, the economy, they had a problem in China that has been going on all throughout much of mankind's history. Most of your people were farmers, but inevitably a poor farmer would find themselves having to sell land to rich. For instance, a family might farm a land for 200 or 300 years, and then come a time of famine or a time of war, and the head of the household might get injured, or several men in the family might get hurt in a war or killed by disease, and the family go into poverty and have to sell their land. And eventually what happened, the rich got almost all the land, and the poor were left with nothing. Again, this is a problem that they've had all the way down through history. And the farmers then became what you call tenant farmer. A tenant farmer is one who does not own the land he farms. He simply farms for the landlord and gives the best of the produce to the landlord and keeps back a little bit for himself. A tenant farmer has virtually little chance to excel. Now, folk, on a personal note, my uncles would criticize my grandfather. My grandfather on my mother's side was a farmer. and he paid rent to a landlady for years and years. And they say, why did he buy the land? I think I know the answer. The idea of getting a 30-year bank loan, they were not available when my grandfather was young. Now today, if a person wants to buy land, he can get a 30-year bank loan if he can convince a bank that he can pay. And after 30 years, the land is his. But a tenant farmer, he can't, I mean, they didn't have bank loans, so he just pays rent every year, and the rent can go up and up as inflation takes over. And he has no chance to own the land, and therefore no chance to get better, hardly any chance to better himself. So, they began using iron tools, something that had not been done before. I mean, folk, it's only been in the early 1800s that we Americans began to realize that the iron plow does not hurt the soil. There were persons even in the 1700s in our own country who believed, no, we should not use iron plows, they hurt the soil. The Chinese used iron plows, and what your book calls natural fertilizer, to be more plain, is human waste, or even animal waste, that your book calls natural fertilizer. This made the Chinese farmland really productive. Rice became their #1 crop. It actually had been the #1 crop. But eventually the average family in China was only able to farm 1 acre because he had to sell the rest of the land. And this was just barely enough for a family's survival. And what happened, and this was to go on until the 20th century when the communists took over, the average Chinese farmer became poorer and poorer and poorer. And this was to lead to rioting, rebellions, and overthrow of governments, and more rioting, more rebellions, and more overthrow of governments. It was to be a problem that was to last them for about 2,000 years.